How connected are our homes to our sense of well-being? Do owner-occupiers fare better than renters on the happiness scale? While owning our own home can certainly provide a sense of stability and control over our living environment, it can also come with financial stress and the responsibility of maintaining your property. And once we're on the property ladder, how long do we relax and bask in the glow of our achievement before we set our sights on a higher rung? What role do other factors such as stage of life, income level, location and personal values play in determining whether homeownership or renting is a better fit for an individual's happiness and well-being? We suspect there's so much more to consider than a binary of renters being unhappy and homeowners being happy, and that's what we'll be discussing today.
Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent and buyer's agent mentor, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, author of Auction Ready and co-host of Your First Home Buyer Guide.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker, recently ranked number 5 in Australia out of over 18,000 brokers in the annual MPA Top 100 Mortgage Broker Awards. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of an appropriate and experienced professional.
Today we've asked a well-being expert to help us better understand the relationship between homeownership and happiness. Dr. Peggy Kern is an associate professor at the Centre for Wellbeing Science within the University of Melbourne's Graduate School of Education, and her resource focuses on understanding, measuring and supporting well-being across the lifespan. She works with schools and workplaces to examine strategies for supporting well-being and bridging gaps between research and practice, and we're really excited about this conversation today. Thank you so much for joining us, Peggy.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Peggy, I absolutely loved an article back in the Sydney Morning Herald back in February. We'll put a link in the show notes up. And the topic was, the title was, Will Buying a New House Actually Make You Happy? And the science in it. And I think it's a really interesting topic, something I've thought about many times. And I guess before we, go into detail about that sort of conversation, how do you think we sort of measure what's your view on measuring happiness or measuring well-being or wellness, or what's your sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that we can actually measure well-being or happiness. Kind of like the two main ways that we can really think about what happiness is. So there's something called hedonic happiness, which is our felt happiness. So sort of like how much positive emotions do we feel? So sort of like, how much do we sort of feel happy, joy, calmness, sort of that sort of felt emotion, and versus that negative emotion. So sadness, anxiety, anger. So that's hedonic happiness. And then there's what's called eudaimonic happiness. And that's much more what's known as the good life. And so how much do I have good relationships with other people? How much do I have a sense of meaning in my life, a sense of purpose? How much am I really accomplishing things in my life? And so that's much more sort of this more holistic sense of the good life. And so oftentimes when we think about happiness, we're often thinking about that sort of hedonic, that emotional sense of happiness. But oftentimes what we actually think about, that fuller sense of contentment, that's actually the eudaimonic side of happiness that we're actually thinking about. And so oftentimes that, if I only have that house, if I have that car, if I have this or that, we're actually pursuing that hedonic sense of happiness. But actually what we really want is that more eudaimonic sense of, really, I've achieved something in my life. I feel a deeper sense of contentment. And that's actually what we really want in our life.
So you can see with homeownership, it gets a bit confusing here because there's achievement. Obviously, it's no mean feat to actually get to the point of owning a home, particularly in this country, right? And it's also tied in with meaningfulness and providing, having your own place and this comfort and shelter, but the emotional side of things as well in terms of your family. So that more of that, and I've used the word emotional probably out of context there in the sense of this discussion, because these things contribute to the general sense of overall well-being. And, we have a place for our family to meet, to shelter, all that sort of stuff. But then there's the idea of, keeping up with the Joneses. And the idea that can't be satisfied then because the home I've got's not as good as what somebody else has got. So I can imagine this whole space, particularly around home ownership or just the sense of home, whether you own it or not, can be quite, and even some renters would go and they couldn't afford to buy a property as good as they can rent. And so they can go for that more flashy lifestyle, for argument's sake. You know what I mean? So it's all complicated, isn't it? Have you actually ever done any specific study on this space?
I haven't done any actual studies on the space, but it's actually exactly what you're saying is that there's a lot of complexity there. And I think that sort of those two sides are actually constantly at interplay with each other. And sort of that, that sense of that eudaimonia is actually at work there of sort of like, I've achieved something. I've actually really gotten there. I've actually really worked hard for things. I have this sense of I've really got into the place I've wanted. But intersecting with that is that constant need for approval, that constant sense of sort of that little dopamine kick that we get in our brain of sort of there's always something that's better. There's that the grass is always greener on the other side. And and there's something called the hedonic treadmill where there's something where we're never actually happy with what we have. And so we get a home and we're happy for a little bit, but then we see something else. And then we say, well, I would only be happier if I actually had that. That's the hedonic side of things. And so then we actually start to all of a sudden say, well, now I'm in this home, but I start to see everything that's wrong with it. And all of a sudden we're discontent with what we have. And instead of actually really resonating with, I've achieved things, I've really have come to a sense of a place of accomplishment, we start to look at that, well, what am I missing? That's kicking into that hedonic side. And so then all of a sudden we're starting to see everything that's wrong with our place. And then we get back to that sense of discontentment and we start comparing ourselves to others. And then we really end up with that sense of discontent and we end up in that unhappiness trap once again.
So the hedonic adaptation, is that something that's like wired? Like no matter your income, where you were born, your race, it's literally everyone's got the same problems. And no matter where you're born in the world, you would naturally have this hedonic adaptation where no matter what you've got, you're always going to want more. You're always going to start thinking, what am I missing? Is you have to basically put in tools to rewire your brain to constantly that battle, I guess.
Yeah. So what has been, it's sort of like this hedonic set point. So in the same way that if you think about your weight, so we kind of have like a weight that we settle at. And so you can diet and you go below your weight, but then oftentimes we come back to that same weight. And if you kind of gain weight, and then you'll actually come back to that weight. So you sort of have a weight set point. In the same way, we sort of have this happiness sort of set point. And you can do things to make yourself like a lot happier for a period of time. But oftentimes you'll come back to sort of this sort of, some people are just naturally a lot happier than others. And other people are just naturally a lot sort of just dispositionally, they're a lot more pessimistic and kind of sadder than others. And so we tend to, now you can change that set point over time. And there are different interventions you can do. So for instance, if each day you really focus on things like doing meditation, gratitude, really focusing on a lot of exercises to really focus on adding a lot of positivity, heartfelt positivity, not sort of just sort of kind of, there's lots of exercises we can do. Some are more heartfelt than others. But if you really work at it, you can actually change your set point over time, but it takes a lot of effort. It's just like any positive habit that we want to incorporate into our life. We can change our set points, but it takes a lot of work and effort over time. So we can change our set points, but it takes a lot of work and effort.
And so what's unsaid there is that probably buying a new home isn't necessarily going to change our set point.
Correct. It's a one-off. And so if we think about our set points are sort of well ingrained. A lot of it is due to our temperament, our biology, our life experiences that have really gotten us to our point. And to change that takes a lot of it. It's like a habit that we have to change through a lot of work and effort over time. And a one-off experience is not going to change that. And so what happens with a one-off experience is we get a real sort of dopamine kick. It really gives us this real, like, this is a great experience, but then we resettle back to our set point very quickly.
So we've all got different set points, right? But is it a set point on the sort of day-to-day feeling of happy versus sad, the joy versus anger, I guess? Or are you saying more the set point in terms of how aspirational you are, how much you really want to achieve in all areas of life, right? So, the person is then ticking their house, then they're ticking their health, and they're ticking their friends, and they're ticking their community. They ultimately have a much higher drive. Their opinion of when they're going to be happy is when they've ticked lots and lots of boxes versus someone who say, no, I'm happy here. I've got my couple of friends, I'm healthy, and so is that where the set point really, you see two different people where they're constantly never enough. They're constantly trying to strive for more. And then someone who's got the ability to say, well, no, I've got everything I need. I'm happy, healthy, I've got shelter. Is that something that's very different for us all? Plus, obviously, the emotional side.
Correct. So some people are very driven and they're always wanting more. And some people are actually very settled and they don't need much to actually feel very settled in life. And some people are very positive and optimistic, and some people are very pessimistic. And so these are personality characteristics that are actually, this is just part of, some of it is biological, some of it is our early experiences in life, and some of it is our adult experiences in life. And so this is sort of these individual differences that we actually experience that makes us who we are as people.
It's fascinating because while you were sort of talking about that, and I'm thinking, one event doesn't change the set point. It sort of, you enjoy it for a little bit of time, then you go back to wherever you were in the first place. And if you're the sort of person that's sort of glass half empty, you may be more inclined to be looking at right now what's next, because I need to fulfill myself again, fill myself up again, and hopefully get that feeling again. If you're the person who's glass half full, naturally inclined, potentially you might be more inclined to enjoy the satisfaction of what you've achieved thus far, or perhaps your set point's lower or whatever. But what about on the negative? I mean, I'm guessing, and we talk about this, particularly with higher interest rates, for instance, is the old frog in the pot thing, like it's you throw the frog in the pot of boiling water, supposedly the frog jumps out. Never seen it happen, but is it you put in a pot of cold water and you turn up the dial on the heat and slowly you get a poached frog. With interest rates rising at the moment, for instance, there's a lot of commentary around, it's shocking and the property market's going to fall off a cliff because people won't buy property because of higher interest rates and all the rest of it. And I'm like, well, actually 10 years ago, interest rates were high and we were all used to it, right? So I sort of feel like the hedonic adaptation must work on the flip side as well. Like things go down and then we get used to it. Does that require our set point to go down? Or does it require just us to get used to different circumstances? How does it work in the reverse?
It works in the reverse the same way. So we get used to things and we just sort of adapt to it. So, we can adapt to it on the positive side, we can adapt to it in the negative side. And sort of the when it goes slowly, we adapt to it. It's when it's that, we get that big jump on things, we adapt, we come back down to our set point. It's when it goes slowly, that's when we actually see the change happen. It's in the same thing with the frog. It's when things move slowly to the positive or to the negative that we actually adjust to things.
So with our homes, there's obviously so many different elements that it could feed into that sort of second moment of, it could also feeds into both, right? It could be those moments you spend with your kids at the house or having friends around. If that home is something that gives you lots of positive emotion, and then it could be around the happiness, and then it could also give you lots of different stress. It could be like, I've got to fix these things. I'm worried about my mortgage. I've got to clean up. I've got to constantly entertain, etc. So do you think that a lot of people just go in assuming that, they're focusing on the short term, security, stability, what the Joneses are doing, but they're potentially not doing enough critical thinking around how is this home actually going to, the cost to benefit, right? The cost is the bigger mortgage, the job, the having to work, the versus the reward, or or maybe just they don't. Yeah, do you think that's where people go wrong? I guess with the pursuit of whether it's a business or money or property or something, is they actually don't know what they're giving up to potentially get it.
I think there needs to be a real thinking about sort of the pros and the cons on sort of the bigger nature of things. And so oftentimes we think about sort of the short-term gains and sort of like that, this is what it's going to give me. And we don't think about sort of the bigger consequences that come with that. And so one thing that could be really helpful is to think about the short-term gains, the short-term consequences, the long-term gains, and the long-term consequences. And so it's sort of like a pros and cons of both short-term and long-term. And if we actually look at the long-term gains, then we can actually sort of get to all of the benefits that we actually get to the home ownership thing. And that actually overrides a lot of those negatives that we actually see. But we actually have to get out of that short-term thinking. So the short-term thinking actually does lead us to the home ownership, but then it also gets us really stuck in a lot of that negative thinking. But the more that we can actually be moving more towards that longer-term thinking, that actually gets us beyond sort of those hiccups that come with sort of the negatives that we actually experience when we get beyond sort of that immediate sort of benefits that we get from the immediate homeowner.
It's so fascinating you say that, because we talk about that a lot, that buying any property, whether it be as a home or as an investment, is a long-term play.
Correct.
And you have to be in it for the long term. From a financial point of view, we're talking here, because that's just the mechanics of the market, the industry, and the costs going in, the costs going out, and all the rest of it. So, but we know that people make short-term decisions, and I hadn't actually thought about it exactly the way you framed it in that way before. That often our dissatisfaction is driven by the fact that we got into the market for short-term thinking, even though, we think if it takes you 9 years to save a deposit, for instance, that it must be long-term thinking, but it still isn't.
It's
so
not.
Isn't that fascinating? I just think that's amazing.
So the more that we can actually be thinking about, actually there, and there's a tool you could do is a pros and cons list, and actually do short-term and long-term pros and cons. That actually moves us beyond sort of those. And again, this moves us from the hedonic to the eudaimonic side of things. And the more we can move to the eudaimonic side of things, that actually moves us more towards that full experience of well-being, as opposed to that short-term experience of happiness.
So back in sort of advice as a financial advisor for a long time, and it's all trying to. I naturally, if you put me in Clifton Strengths Finder, I'm like futuristic. I'm always thinking forward, and that's type of my personality. But that's not what everyone is, right? Everyone's got different strengths, etc. So I'm thinking about this, and it's trying to get clients to start, and that's naturally why people delay financial decisions, planning for retirement, their health. Lots of things. People can't connect with their future self, I guess. Is that sort of a part of it? People, are so stuck in, I can't imagine what I'm going to look like or feel like, or what my life's going to be like 5 years time, let alone when I'm going to be, when I'm 60. And that bridging that's actually potentially going to happen, you need to start planning for it now. Like, what's sort of the best ways, do you think, for people to get in that long-term thinking? And because that's when they make the sacrifice, right? They say, look, okay, maybe in the short term, the pros and cons are pretty even. Like, if anything, they're actually a negative in the short term, because I've got to live in an area maybe I don't want to live right now. I've got to pay a bigger mortgage. I've got to leave my friends. I've got to leave my family. I've got to make new friends. And actually, it's actually from a cash flow point of view, I can't go on that holiday. And then, I've got a nice house, but I've nowhere, no one wants to come and visit me. But longer term, it's maybe really heavily weighted, a much better decision. How do you suggest people to get in that mindset of their future self? Like, there's a lot of, AI sort of imagery stuff at the moment. And, that's like, even just seeing a picture of yourself in ages. I know financial advisors used to use that a little bit. Have you seen what's some good ideas for people to get in that long-term thinking?
One thing to even do is there's an exercise called best possible selves, or best future selves, which is really where you just take some time and just write about your best possible future. And it's a simple exercise, but you just take some time and imagine yourself in 5 or 10 years in the future, and write down what yourself looks like. And it's an imaginary exercise, but it's actually saying, this is what my life would look like as I'm living my best possible life. And it actually gets us out of the current life that we're actually in, and is imagining this life that I'm actually living when I'm imagining my best possible self. And that moves us into the future. And actually, in that case, then we can start to be imagining, once we imagine that, then we can say, what are the steps that I need to take to actually get there? And that actually moves us to saying, well, yeah, I can buy that house, because that would actually be moving me towards living that life that I actually want to be living.
And what's your thoughts around like natural resilience, like that we, as humans just adapt to whatever our circumstances are, and we almost can be happy within any circumstances so no matter what happens to our financial self, right, that our baseline happy would stay the same. So yeah, maybe we don't have the car, maybe we have the kids, and maybe we struggle, and maybe we have to, be a bit tight with our shopping. But ultimately, I'm still living the same sort of similar happy life because I'm just living on my set point. And I'm getting just as much feelings of joy in the small things. Maybe it's the sunrise, but I'm still. How do you feel about that? Is it all sort of meaningless a little bit because naturally you're just going back to your set point anyway?
We do see that in the research. And so based on studies, we do see that. So looking at the question of satisfaction with life, so how satisfied are you with your life? The studies have looked at people who have experienced a lot of trauma in their life, including things like losing loved ones or injury and illness, and then really positive things in life, such as getting married, having kids, and other things that we'd expect as having really positive results, winning the lotto. And what we see is the positive events create a short-term, very boost in emotion, in sort of satisfaction with life, and the negative events create a very negative experience in life satisfaction, but it returns over time to that sort of set point. And so what we see is that the negative does not have nearly as what people expect is that the negative would have a huge sort of long-term consequence on satisfaction in life, and that the positive would have a long-term, if I just win lotto, that, my life would be better forever, and what we actually see, if anything, winning the lotto actually creates a lot of complications in life, because all of a sudden people love you for your money. They don't love you for yourself. And so if anything, it actually creates a lot of complications in your life that actually undermines well-being. And
I just watched the Whitney Houston movie last night, and yeah, exactly. It was like, dad's a loving father, was probably not that situation, but then, all of a sudden he's stealing from his daughter in the end, right? And it's like, and you see that all the stats with people who are successful sports people and, lotto, etc. They look back on their life. A lot of them would say, I probably wish I never got the money, right? Because the damage has just been so prolific, and they'd love to go back in time. Yeah.
And if we actually look at, so there's been some studies that have looked at people. So this comes from the Blue Zone studies that have looked at people who live very long lives. So centenarians that have, more people who live much longer lives than we'd expect. And what we see as the biggest things that impact their lives are people who have really good connections with other people, and a huge sense of purpose for their lives. And so there's a real reason for why they live their lives. And then there's things like diet and exercise and, a good environment and whatnot. But at the heart of it is being a part of a community, and so we think about, if we're buying property, how can you become a part of the community that you're a part of? So it's not just buying a house, you're buying a house as part of a community, and having a sense of purpose, which I think, buying a property that this is giving you a sense of, this is a purpose for my family and the community that I'm a part of, that can actually be a huge part of supporting well-being.
I'm on a personal mission to help more people make better property decisions. And you can find out all about what I'm working on at veronicamorgan.com.au. And there you'll find resources for first home buyers, details about my buyer's agent mentoring program, access to suburb help for investors, or if you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or lower North Shore, you can connect with my team at Good Deeds Property Buyers.
If you're thinking about buying your first home, upgrading to a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, we would love to carefully guide you through this journey and importantly get the finance right. Please reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
Don't forget that you can download our free full or forecaster report. Which experts can you trust to get it right? theelephantintheroom.com.au.
It's quite interesting. We're dealing with clients, and there are some clients where location is like the primary driver, and it's because of all those networks and connections that they have. There's also, there's a stop factor as well, in the sense that I don't want to leave here because that's all, there's, once again, it's complex, because, there might be a certain location they're living in that to leave that would feel like a backward step. So there's that, but there's also very much that, this is where my people are, this is where my community is, where I belong, this is where I socialize, this is where my kids' networks are, et cetera, et cetera. But just back to your, I'm sort of visualizing the different graphs, so, that one-off negative or positive event that has an immediate rise or decrease in dopamine. And then you've got this tapering off as over time our state of being or our emotional state returns to the set point. Does it take longer to bounce back from the negatives, to return there from negatives on in the studies than a positive, or vice versa, or is it roughly the same?
It does take, actually, so the positive does come back down to baseline faster than the recovery from the negative. Yep. So we do think that the recovery from the negative does take longer in terms of the recovery time. And it does depend on the supports that are there. So the more supports that are there, the easier the recovery. But those hard times really are hard to recover from. And the more supports that are there, the easier the recovery actually is.
Has there been any study on if someone has a major setback? Some people's reaction is to be busy. I mean, I know for me personally, if I have a setback, I'm like, right, what can I do to fix it? What can I do about that? And because I'm an action-oriented person, and it's not always in my best mental, the best for my mental health really, but, that's the sort of way I'm wired. And so I go and, all right, I'll go and buy a new home or I'll go and get married. No, I wouldn't do that. But I mean, I'll go and create a positive thing to offset the negative. I mean, I know I'm sort of going down a rabbit hole here, but can it help you get back to your set point faster? I mean, is that a credible thing to do, to sort of pattern interrupt at that point, or is we just still overcomplicating things?
Well, in many ways, it's actually sort of it's a way of sort of deflecting the pain, and it's sort of a way of diffusing things in order to sort of keep busy and sort of actually diffuse the pain so you don't actually have to deal with it. And in a lot of ways, it's actually a very healthy coping mechanism. And for a lot of things, it can actually work very well. The way it is not healthy is when there is some really deep pain that you actually need to actually face. And so, so for a lot of things that actually works very well, you can just sort of diffuse it in terms of pouring yourself into other things. But when there's sort of something deep that's there that you actually need to face, then there's sometimes I remember when I was in university, I was taking an abnormal psych course, and the professor talked about when there's a lot of pain there, we try everything to go around the pain. But the best way to do it is to actually face the pain. And so sometimes it's like this big mountain, and we do everything to go around the mountain, but sometimes we actually have to face the mountain. And so for some things, actually the best way to actually deal with it, as painful as it is to actually face it directly. And so sometimes when there is something really painful there, as hard as it is, we actually need to face it directly. And that's with the love and support of others to actually, deal with some of the deep issues that are there.
So getting busy and I've seen people do this. This is one of the reasons I ask, because, it's like, okay, I know what you moving will solve my problem, or you know what I mean? It's like, there's this, as you say, deflection, which is quite interesting. But I can't help but think about loss aversion.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think also about when people miss out at auction and then they go and buy the very next week. I've called it the rebound property. They've just been dumped, and so they go right off with the next property they meet. And I often worry. I think, oh my God, when you wake up from that hangover, you're not going to be real happy because you didn't even buy the right property, But it does happen. And sort of tied in with loss aversion, because we talk about behavioural biases on this podcast a lot. And obviously we do understand that the fear of the pain of the loss is greater than the fear of the pain of, not the fear of the pain of the gain, our anticipation of the pleasure of the gain. So therefore we'll err away from loss. How does that sort of feed into all this?
So really with that is sort of like it's constantly trying to pursue that dopamine hit, and is so much afraid of losing that dopamine hit that it's actually, instead of actually sitting in that discomfort, that it's actually pursuing that, and actually, it can create a lot of problems actually, because then you're just buying property to actually fill that need that's actually there, as opposed to actually sitting in some of that discomfort to actually get to the better property that is actually going to better fulfill your actual needs. So from a well-being perspective, you're actually going to be better off to actually sit in some of the discomfort to actually get to the better property that's there. So well-being, from a well-being perspective, is actually at times sitting in discomfort in order to actually get the better outcome. So oftentimes well-being, oftentimes people think like it's just feeling good all the time, but that's actually not true. Well-being is actually at times sitting in discomfort, so you actually get the better feeling that comes out of that deeper level of well-being, as opposed to just going after that good feeling.
I think you've really nailed it. There's kind of hit the nail on the head for the whole episode, I guess. I think there's two parts. There's one, the investors. So we see a lot of people who have come to us and they haven't dealt with that pain, right? They've bought properties, they've got lots of properties, and maybe part of them is just accruing because they're trying to, just keep accruing. So that's maybe the hedonic part. But then it's also they're not dealing with the pain, right? And they'll come to someone like me and they'll be like, don't buy anymore. Maybe you should be doing selling, right? You've bought all these duds, right? So it's the loss aversion that facing that pain head on is quite confronting. So they just, she'll be right, mate. I'll just, try to buy other properties. And I think the home ownership thing's a really interesting one. I mean, Veronica and I, we really encourage people to think through the longer term, the livability, how it suits their lifestyle, the negatives of living in that property versus that property, and making sure it's the right fit for them. And I think a lot of buyers, are focused on, just getting into the market, etc. But they're not spending enough time thinking, well, I'm going to live in this house for, 10, 15 years. Because if it doesn't satisfy a level to their happiness score, let's say, then ultimately in a few years' time, they're going to start picking up on those negatives, and those negatives are going to start nagging in their brain, aren't they? And they're going to have that resentful. They're going to be like, well, maybe we should have waited, or but that's painful. So I'm just going to get stuck in this house that ultimately isn't satisfying what I really wanted. And I think that's all leads back to that first decision. Is that sort of where you think it links into home buying, is that we are focused? Yeah.
Correct. 100%. So it just sort of like it's going after that. It's trying to fill that need that's there. And so it's just trying to fill that need. And so I buy this home, but then it just gets under the skin. And then you end up with all this resentment that's there that really undermines that sense of well-being, as opposed to stepping back, sitting in some of that discomfort, but then ending up with the property that actually gives you that sense of deeper fulfillment, that eudaimonic sense of well-being that you're actually really happy with. And so it takes longer And there's pain involved with it. It's sitting in discomfort of saying like, oh, wow, I didn't get it at the first chance or whatever. But you actually end up with the property that is actually the right one for you. And then you don't have those resentments there. And then you're actually really happy with the choices that you've made.
I think the community part is something that, because I've read a lot about this stuff. I'm quite fascinated by it, for years in the financial advice space. And the relationship element, right? The community, the connection to the community. A big part of that's being able to afford to live in a place and having a place that's actually suitable for your life. Then you've got this kids' schooling, you've got, access to family, access to work, etc. And so there's so many, it's trying to balance all those elements, but then also then to find something, not where you can live today, but something that you can grow into the community. I think, it's one of the reasons why people don't downsize from their house, right? Because they're so entrenched in that community with their neighbor who's actually now a good friend who, and they that sense of potentially upsetting relationships basically is the reason why they end up staying in a house, I guess. Is that because they matter more than ever to their happiness?
Yep. And that's what we really see. One of the biggest contributors to well-being is that sense of community and those relationships with others. And so, that sense of community and connection with others is absolutely critical to well-being. And so it keeps people in their homes, it connects people to others, and is a core contributor to the decisions that we make about where we live.
So this is interesting because there's so much, I guess, our governments, for instance, are trying to do things like change stamp duty because they're trying to change the way people behave around their property. And they're using incentives, a typical economic sort of model of, that we behave according to incentives. But then if they don't look at this behavioural side of things, it's just what they miss, because a lot of people, we're talking about community, a lot of people don't want to downsize because they don't want to basically disrupt that. And so you can give them all the incentives in the world financially once they're at a certain point. Is it also around, Maslow's hierarchy of needs as well? This idea of, there's however 7 or 8 or whatever in that triangle. You've got the bottom rung of the ladder is the basic, food, water, shelter, basically. And then the very top is self-actualization. Do you think that we sort of self-actualize ourselves sometimes into a state of unhappiness? Like in the sense that I always looked at that and thought, that's because, we're basically like our own personal guru by the time we get to the top of the triangle. But I also wonder about how much of this, our pursuit for happiness is a first world problem. I wonder if it's a luxury that we have because we're in an affluent society.
It is a luxury that we have as an affluent society, but at the same time, we're undermining all of that because one of our very basic needs, that connection with others, is completely undermined. So as a society, we're more connected than ever, but we're completely alone, and so the second need is a sense of belonging with others. And so we're more connected with than others, but then people are completely alone and disconnected with one another. And so it's a first world problem, but it's a problem that we actually have. And so, a huge driver of problems that we have is that people feel very alone and disconnected. And so we're not even getting to the higher needs because that very second need of connecting with other is completely undermined. And that's critical. And when we're thinking about the homes that we have and the communities that we're living in, that's something that we really need to be thinking about is how can we be connecting with the neighbors that are around us? How can we be buying homes that we're going to be connecting with our neighbors and being a part of the communities that we're within? That we're not just buying homes, we're buying homes within communities because that's going to be critical to every other need that we have.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's Gallup. I'm not sure, but they did some research around sort of well-being, right? I think they've written books. I've read a book on it before, and one of their research was that if you earned a certain income, then your happiness was at pretty much peak, and then it was the law of diminishing value, right? Like so, if your income was 90,000, I think it was, you've got 98% of your happiness you need because you can satisfy most of your things. And then, but if your income went to 250 or 300 or a million, you don't get this, exponential happiness. But then there's been reports recently that are sort of kind of argued that against that. What's your sort of take on, the financial aspect? Because you said community is really important in terms of well-being, right? So financial stability or financial success, how important is that when you compare it to other things like health or, purpose or, doing something that's really giving you that reward? Like, how is it really not as big as people ultimately expect? Because they get these short-term hits, but then they go back to their baseline. So they get this new car or the house and it doesn't really, it's not going to get you any much happier, if that sort of makes sense.
Correct. So what we see is the financial element matters to a certain point. So if you're living in poverty, then finances make a huge difference. So, if you don't have your basic needs covered, then that's a huge issue. So you need to have your basic needs covered. But beyond that, then money does not make much of a difference. And that actually a lot of the people that have a lot of money are very unhappy. They are burning through relationships. They are not getting their needs met. They have all the money they need, and they are incredibly unhappy. They don't have lives.
I often say that money doesn't buy happiness, but lack of it sure can make you unhappy. On that though, have there been studies, and I'm assuming that there's studies around the life stage? So obviously, your home and housing requirements will differ according to where you are in your life stage. So do you think that there's the home itself or owning a home or even just secure rental tenure, making a home, I should say, let's say making a home, does it become more important at different life stages, do you think, or is it fairly standard, like a fairly static?
I think it does become more important. So there's sort of like, there's leaving home to begin with, and we are seeing that extending out. So young people are staying with their parents much longer. So that's sort of, we have seen a real shift where it used to be young people left home at a much earlier age. We're seeing young people staying at home much longer than in the past. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But there is sort of a benefit of seeing young people go out and starting to rent and then starting to own homes. But you do see sort of that sense of accomplishment and achievement coming around owning a home, starting your life on your own and whatnot. And then we see different trends as you go on to sort of, different home ownership. And then actually you see downsizing as you get later in life. And so you see different trends as you go across the life stage and sort of the needs that you have at different stages of life.
Because some people, when they're downsizing, I've dealt with many people over the years, and some see it as a real negative thing, and other people actually see it as a positive thing. So it's really interesting, sort of back to that natural state, I guess, as to how somebody might view that.
Yep.
And how long they leave it.
I think a lot of it depends on the values that people have. So, and how much are they sort of like the element of materialism and how much they value materialism. So some people really value sort of those they really value materialism. And so in that case, downsizing is very much a negative because then I have to get rid of things. Whereas others actually don't value materialism. And so downsizing is actually a really positive thing because I'm actually getting rid of these things and I'm not holding on to things. And so that's where our values really intersect with our sense of well-being in terms of our lifestyle choices.
Peggy, I think in terms of like homes, right? So there's a rising co-living, right? Where people are sharing living spaces, some cultures around the happiest countries in the world, right? The Danes and the Scandinavians, right? Co-living multi-generational families, etc. I think in places like Australia, we live in individual apartments within a building, right? And we're all got our own doors, and no one knows each other on their own floors. And in houses and communities, we've all got big fences. And do you think that we've almost designed our society, the property market, let's say, that doesn't link into ultimate well-being? Because if anything, we shouldn't have fences, right? We shouldn't have these big privacy. We shouldn't be having, all going into our separate little apartments when you'll never bump into anyone besides maybe in a lift and you won't say hello. Do you think that that's a key problem that we're not identifying, and that, you know, it'll constantly lead to inadequacy around our housing decisions because we're obviously striving for the wrong type of result.
Yep. So we've seen a real shift in terms of like how our housing looks. So in the past, it was like you'd have families living together. So you would actually have multiple generations that are all influencing one another. You have this cohabitation and whatnot. And now we've shifted to, you know, individual people, lots of singles. You have the apartments where everyone's living on their own without this interaction with one another. And we, at the same time, we've seen rises in loneliness. We've seen rises in mental illness. And so there's, you know, this is all that we're seeing reasons for these trends and whatnot. And so a lot, in many ways, the design of our living situations are paralleling our mental illness trend.
Yeah. And do you think that's where it's too late to unwind a little bit? I mean, we had a placemaker come on. I totally forget who that was. We had a whole conversation around the importance of councils and governments and reactivating, you know, the CBDs or reactivating parks, etc. And do you think that this is where, you know, it's almost got to be a part council, you know, part government, where they say, what does this really community stand for? How do we get this community better connected? And rather than, you know, 1,000 properties in this community that just pay us rates.
I think it needs to be community action. And I think there's a lot more that we could be doing to actually be redesigning our living situations. I think how our, you know, I think there's a lot that's being done. This is actually separating people more and more, as opposed to actually moving more towards creating community. And we know how important those social connections are. And I think there's a lot that's actually pushing us more towards isolation, which is actually really problematic and undermines well-being.
Yeah, I think we're doing a big reno in a few years. We're just sort of planting in the front garden, and I've chatted to a few architects, and I just really like the idea. I've seen some gardens that, you know, you see them right around you, Veronica, actually, in the inner west. It's like, it's almost like, hey, this is public space. It's my garden, right? But it's at the front of my house. But my attitude is, and I'm just putting a big fence up and a big hedge, and see you later, guys. I'm going to my den. It's almost like, can I transform this space to connect to the community? Can I have a window at the front that actually people can see in? Do I have like places to sit? Do I, and you know, the passerbys will connect with you as a house. You know, do you think that that's sort of a way of people to, you know, maybe flip the idea of home ownership, is actually no, like you were saying, I actually need to connect. I can't just go and hide away. Ultimately, my happiness, it will become through being better connected to the people around me.
I think it's a way to connect, and I think it's something that draws people in. I think we see it whenever there are public spaces like it, that people come to it, where people are longing for it. And that's exactly what we need to actually reconnect people together. And I think people are longing for it, and that's what we need in our communities.
Well, maybe COVID gave us that for that minute, right? You didn't see anyone, so you said hello to someone when you walked past them. But, you know, we just gone back to, you know, pre-2019, right, where we all went back to ourselves, so we didn't care about the people around us. Do you think that that's you know, one of the biggest challenges and one of the positives that COVID sort of shone a light on?
I think it's you know, like COVID gave us a chance, like we started actually interacting with each other and caring for each other. And I think that's something that we actually need to carry on and actually say, you know, we started really connecting with each other locally. And I think that's something that we see the research, how important those connections are in terms of supporting well-being. And that's something that we individually can each take action. You know, when we walk by each other, say hello to each other, look each other in the eye. Those are those little pieces of connection that we can be creating connection in our community. And that is incredibly important for our own well-being and the well-being of others around us.
I think that what you're talking about there is such a classic example of the hedonic adaptation, though, isn't it? It's like, you know, during COVID, we did things differently. And then basically when the threat has been removed, not that saying COVID has been removed to people, but the threat has been removed, then we all go back to our, you know, business as usual. We'd rather isolate. And it's actually, for myself personally, I actually found myself becoming a bit of a hermit, and I'm quite outgoing. And so I've actually put in place sort of post-COVID, actually some sort of social cohesion and, you know, efforts, if you like. I've got 2 WhatsApp groups going now which are fantastic. Actually connecting people and sort of like the 6 degrees of separation thing, and connecting people as well that wouldn't have known each other, and then that sort of springboards something else, or creating something different. But that has taken a conscious decision and an action, and I guess that's what we all need to do. But it's interesting. We interviewed Jeremy McLeod some weeks back. We'll have to put the links to the episodes we're mentioning here. And he's a director of Breathe architecture practice in Melbourne, but also one of the co-founders of the Nightingale Housing Project, and a big part of those projects is about community and connection. So it is, but it's still not in the mainstream, is it? It's still in the margins here. And yet, like you say, it's a core need of ours. And yet we're not very good at really, I guess, of prioritising it in many ways. So this has been a really interesting conversation. I'm just wondering if you have an example of a property dumbo for us. So this is just something that, a lesson we can all learn through a story of somebody may have done around property. Do you have an example for us?
Yeah. So I'll give a story of my own property. So during COVID, they set up a nice community garden. And it was really interesting in terms of coordinating it off during COVID to be like, we can't actually go in there because of COVID. But then people kept going in there anyways in order to actually care for the garden. And the garden is flourishing in terms of creating a sense of connection. And so there's sort of like this sense of as we've talked about here, this sense of creating a little bit of connection around creating a garden and connection between each other. And we have no idea who goes in there and who does things, but it's a way of creating connection and community within a community of apartments where people don't know each other, people don't connect with each other, but it's within a community it's through a garden that people actually create connection within a garden. And so I think that's a perfect example of, through little ways, how we can actually be creating connection within these individual apartment areas that do not create much connection, but there are those little ways that we can create connection through the little things that we do within our community.
So we're going to take the dumbo from that as any building that has the potential to do that hasn't yet. Any people that live in a building that could have done that haven't. Here's your opportunity. It doesn't have to take lockdowns.
It doesn't take much space. It's just a little bit of space, a little bit of time, and a little bit of connection, and we can all create connection through it.
Could just be a herb garden with a lime tree.
Well, yeah, and ultimately it's actually great for property values, right? So if you think about, not that I'm always thinking about the money side, but it is actually, if people are investing in a garden, right, they're investing in their homes, they're investing in their community, they're going to live in those properties longer. So less of them are going to come on the market. People are going to be more attracted to live in those properties because they've heard about the community and they know how, and so places that obviously give that lifestyle benefit is actually also then tangible to the demand and supply metrics of things. And so, even if you're doing it for financial reasons, you should be encouraging your building to connect more, right? To have a better community. And then obviously there's a lot of other reasons that are much bigger. So thanks so much for coming on, Peggy. This is an interesting chat that will be an age-old problem, I feel. If you come back in 10 years' time, we'll still be dealing with the people getting better at managing their own well-being. So thanks, Peggy. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much.
If you have a question that you'd like us to answer in an upcoming Q&A episode, you can send us a voicemail or written question via the website, theelephantintheroom.com.au, or you can email us directly at questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au. If you like what you're hearing, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars would be great. I know that sounds a bit cringy, but we have it on good authority that every review helps make it easier for other people to find out about us and hear what our amazing guests have to say.